Hi everybody, Terry Ryder from Hotspotting, continuing my series of short broadcasts addressing media misinformation about what's happening with prices around Australia, responding to the general theme or implication in articles and headlines across mainstream media that prices are falling pretty much everywhere across Australia. Australian property prices fall for 12 months in a row, that kind of headline. It's certainly giving the implication that there are weak markets everywhere, and it simply isn't true. There was some analysis published in the last week by CoreLogic, which looked at the 88 sub-regions of Australia. The sub-regions are the small regions that the Australian Bureau of Statistics carves the nation up into to collect data of all sorts. And when the CoreLogic looked at the 88 sub-regions, it found about half of them still have prices rising, including many that have prices rising at rates higher than their 5-year averages. A lot of the growth markets are happening in regional Australia. About 60% of the sub-regions that are in regional Australia have growing prices at the moment, according to this analysis. And also 40% of the sub-regions within our capital cities have growing prices, including in our two biggest cities. The implication in the headlines is that prices are pretty much falling everywhere in Sydney and Melbourne. Whereas it's clear that both those markets have passed their peak, and some sectors of the market have fallen prices. How much they're falling depends on whose figures you believe, but it's certainly not true to say that all markets are falling. In general terms, it's the top end of the two biggest cities where we're seeing some price decline. The middle market in both cities seems to be holding up fairly well. And then the outer ring areas, the cheaper areas, the lower priced areas are the ones that are still showing price growth, including very strong price growth in Melbourne, less so in Sydney. So there was an analysis published by Domain in the last few days, which showed that there are about 100 suburbs in Sydney where prices are still rising. They're in the minority, but there's still a significant number of markets where the price is rising, putting to light at the implication in media coverage that just everywhere is seeing price collapse in Sydney simply isn't true. But particularly in Melbourne, we've been doing a particular research exercise recently, including having a look at what prices are doing suburb by suburb in Melbourne, and it's quite an interesting exercise because it shows that I've been making a list of suburbs in the Melbourne metropolitan area where prices have grown 10% or more in the last 12 months, including substantial growth in the last quarter, which means prices are still rising in those areas. And there's more than 100 suburbs in the Melbourne metropolitan area where that is happening. So there's a lot of places are still getting very strong price growth in the Melbourne market, contrary to the headlines suggesting that property values are falling across Melbourne at about $1,000 a week. Now, what I've found in analysing the Melbourne market suburb by suburb is that in general terms, the top end suburbs, the $1 million suburbs, those are the ones that are seeing a decline in prices, which probably shouldn't surprise us because those are the ones that took off first and grew the most, initially at least. The middle market suburbs are kind of holding the line. Many of them still have moderate price growth happening, though some of them have moderate price decline happening. But at the lower end, the outer ring areas where the first home buyers are very active at the moment, there's very, very strong price growth in those cheaper areas of the Melbourne metropolitan area. Most of the suburbs in the Whittlesea, Hume, Wyndham, Casey, Frankston, those sorts of local government areas on the outer ring areas of the Melbourne metropolitan area, most of the suburbs there have had really strong price growth in the last 12 months, 15%, 20%, 25%, including strong price growth in the last quarter, which means prices are still rising in those markets. Now that trend, which I'm finding in Melbourne, which says that the top end is falling, the middle market's kind of holding the line on prices, and the bottom end still rising strongly. That's kind of reflected in another analysis I saw in the last few days out of CoreLogic, where they divided the capital cities into 3 market sectors, upper, middle and lower, and they did the same for the combined regionals. And what they found was pretty similar to what I've just found exploring the suburbs of Melbourne. That is that the upper quartile, the top end suburbs, the $1 million suburbs, have shown price decline. According to these figures, about 6% overall, dragged down primarily by Sydney and to a lesser extent Melbourne. The middle market is kind of holding the lines, very moderate decline overall in prices there. And then the lower quartile, the cheaper areas of our capital cities have seen some price rises, and including some very strong ones in the Melbourne market. And across the combined regionals, all three sectors of the market are up. So it just reflects the fact that a lot of the strongest property markets at the moment in terms of price growth actually in the regions. They're being ignored, of course, by the media coverage. Most of our major media comes out of Sydney. So we've got Sydney writers writing articles that reflect what's happening in their backyard and extrapolating it into a national situation, which is very unprofessional, unethical, and simply inaccurate. Meanwhile, out in regional Australia, in some of our smaller cities, there's very strong markets, and many of the strongest markets, as I say, are in regional Australia. We're seeing Geelong prices are still rising really strongly. Geelong's probably the single strongest market in Australia in terms of price growth in the last 12 months. Newcastle's also been strong. The Sunshine Coast, I mentioned in a broadcast recently, double-digit price growth right across the suburbs of the Sunshine Coast, including some that are above 15% and a few that are above 20% in terms of annual price growth. So plenty of growth markets in Australia. I just wish media could give us some balanced, fair, accurate and ethical coverage of what's actually really going on, rather than the clickbait headlines that they seem to think somehow serve a purpose, screaming negative sensationalism, which really certainly doesn't serve their readers, their consumers, who are hungry for real information. So seeking to put a little bit of balance into the debate about what's happening with prices. According to these figures that I have in front of me, around 100 suburbs in Sydney still got growing prices, even more so in Melbourne, particularly in the outer ring, lower priced areas. And then again, we have numerous regional markets showing price growth, including the Sunshine Coast, including Geelong, including other regional areas close to Melbourne, many regional areas of New South Wales as well. That's it for now. I'll continue the discussion with further broadcasts later this week and in coming weeks. So that's it for now. Terry Ryder signing off. Talk to you again soon.